FORA.tv. The world is thinking.
For 2 or 3 years after the US invasion of Afghanistan in October 2001, there was very little sign of the Taliban. But more recently, they seem to be everywhere. How did this happen?
Well, we should remember that the Taliban were never defeated by the American forces in Afghanistan. They were routed, and much of the leadership retreated into Pakistan. And they took several years there to reorganize themselves, and by 2003 they were back in action in Afghanistan, using their sanctuaries in Pakistan in order to rearm and recruit and reorganize. Since then, of course, they've expanded rapidly. They've developed close links with Al-Qaeda, with other groups from Central Asia. And of course, because they were in Pakistan, they played a major role in mobilizing what we now call Pakistani Taliban. That is Pashtun tribesmen living in Pakistan along the border who are now threatening the state of Pakistan.
But why do you think it is that the Taliban were not defeated? I mean, why didn't that happen at the time that they were routed?
I think a very short-sighted policy by the US military. The US military, I think, already wanted to use 9/11 as the excuse to go into Iraq. They did not deploy sufficient numbers of troops in Afghanistan. They depended on their allies, the Northern Alliance, to do the fighting for them. And they weren't concerned about the Taliban. They allowed the Taliban to retreat. They were far more concerned about Al-Qaeda.
Barney, can you tell us, do you agree with that assessment of US policy in Afghanistan immediately following the invasion?
Mainly, I would just say, I think maybe this is what Ahmed meant too, the decision not to go after the Taliban was not made by the military. It was made by the civilian leadership of the United States government, and it was based on a strategic choice they made, which again was not made by the military, which was resisted by some people in the military, which was the choice to put most of their resources into Iraq. So that it was basically a political decision, not a military decision, to shift resources from Afghanistan into Iraq. In addition, the US, and again, this came from the top, not from uniformed military officers, defined the mission in Afghanistan as a counterterrorism mission, defined in the narrowest possible way, that is, killing and capturing the people who were responsible for September 11th and those who sheltered them. The United States did call in the United Nations to sponsor a political transition and reconstruction, but it wanted it to be carried out by others while it concentrated its resources on something else, namely Iraq.
Well, both of you have suggested that the US government was more interested in capturing Al-Qaeda than Taliban. Can you explain what the distinction between the two organizations is, who is a member of which, and where exactly they're located in Afghanistan and Pakistan along the border areas? Do they work together at all? Are they completely separate?
Well, I think over the years we've seen a lot of cooperation between Al-Qaeda and Taliban. In the northwest region of Pakistan, they are living together. You've got Taliban, you've got Afghan Taliban, you've got the allies of the Taliban, various commanders who are allied to the Taliban. You've got Al-Qaeda made up of Arabs, some of these Central Asian groups, Chechen groups who retreated back in 2001 are also living there. They're under their own command, but they're closely allied with the Taliban. But I think one thing the Pakistanis did was that they maintained the Taliban leadership further south in Baluchistan province, in the capital in Quetta. And by doing that, what they basically told the Americans was that as the Taliban leadership is in Quetta, if it is in Quetta, and there were no Arabs there, there were no, as Barney said, no targets that the Americans wanted. So essentially the Taliban leadership in Quetta was left alone because it stayed clear of the Arabs, it stayed clear of, they did have links, of course, but there were no Arab recruits based in Quetta. So Quetta itself did not become a target for the US military or the US government. And that continued until in fact recently, when NATO troops deployed for the first time in 2005, 2006 into southern Afghanistan. And then NATO faced a crisis because then NATO suddenly realized that, they were not facing so much the Al-Qaeda forces, but they were facing these reorganized Taliban.
But why is it that the Pakistani government, Musharraf, why did he provide protection to some of the Taliban?
Well, I think there were a lot of reasons. Number one, Pakistan has largely viewed Afghan policy through the prism of India, its main enemy. And they did not want to give India a foothold in Afghanistan. Secondly, they were very suspicious of the Northern Alliance commanders, who after 9/11 were given the majority of power in Kabul. They were equally suspicious of Hamid Karzai because, he had close links with India also. And I think, they wanted to keep the Afghan Taliban as an option. After all, they had backed the Afghan Taliban right through the 1990s. And even though Musharraf had done this U-turn after 9/11 and he promised to help the Americans overthrow the Taliban, once the Taliban regime was overthrown, he didn't want to dispense with the Taliban altogether. The other reason simply was that there was a political configuration in Pakistan backing the military, which included Islamic fundamentalist parties who were also pro-Taliban. So he didn't want to break his political alliance at home by stamping down on the Taliban.